Imagine standing in the heart of the desert, beneath a heavy and silent sky, facing a nation that dared to defy the heavens. An empire built on stone, gold, and gods, and a people enslaved for centuries, on the brink of collapse. But then, something changes. The sacred river, Egypt's lifeblood, turns into blood. The earth shakes, the sky goes dark, and the unthinkable happens. An empire kneels. Could this be divine intervention, or a sequence of perfectly timed natural events? This is the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt and the exodus of the Hebrews. But how did it really unfold? For centuries, millions believed that each plague was a supernatural display of God's power against an arrogant pharaoh, a cosmic battle between the Creator and Egypt's gods. But what if there's another explanation? What if the events described in the Bible are echoes of natural disasters that, because of their timing and impact, were interpreted as miracles? Science, archaeology, and history have begun to shed new light on this ancient account, and what's being uncovered could forever change everything you thought you knew about this story. This video isn't just about faith or science. It's a journey through the mysteries of time, where we invite you to look into the past with sharp eyes, unafraid to question, to feel, to discover. Because maybe, just maybe, understanding how and why these plagues happened could help us grasp something even greater: the role of the divine in the chaos of nature and the power of faith in the midst of an empire's collapse. Get ready to dive into a narrative that blends history, religion, and science like you've never seen before. Over the next few minutes, we'll explore every detail with precision and depth, from Egypt's political and cultural context to the enigmatic figure of Moses. From the Nile waters turning red to the death of the firstborn, each plague, each event will be examined through two lenses: faith and reason. And in the end, the unavoidable question will arise: if there are natural explanations for each plague, does that take away from the miracle or make it even more extraordinary? What if the plagues were like dominoes, falling one after another in a perfectly plausible chain reaction? What if science can explain each phenomenon, but not the coincidence of them happening at that exact time, to that specific people, in that exact place? What's harder to believe, that God intervened in history, or that nature conspired to free the Hebrews the moment they cried out for help? Each possibility is as fascinating as the other. You'll discover intriguing interpretations of the plagues, from toxic algae that turned the Nile red to the theory of a distant volcano that may have spewed ash over Egypt, darkening the skies and contaminating the food supply. Scientists, theologians, and archaeologists help us piece together this millennia-old puzzle, whose fragments are scattered across ancient papyri, forgotten fossils, and oral traditions preserved with reverence. But be warned, this won't be a typical investigation. Here, the sacred and the natural walk side by side. No matter what you believe, this story holds something that transcends time: the struggle for freedom, the fall of an empire before a man who believed he was being guided by something greater. And maybe, just maybe, the plagues of Egypt aren't a supernatural tale, but humanity's greatest mystery between chance and purpose. Stay with us until the end, because the revelation might lie in the detail no one ever noticed. Now, before we move on, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and turn on notifications, because this journey is just beginning. If you enjoy videos that uncover the deepest mysteries of the Bible with an investigative and revealing approach, hit the like button and share this video with someone who, just like you, is trying to understand what really happened back then. Because today, we go beyond the words, we go straight to the heart of the truth. In the next chapter, we'll travel back in time to understand how the Hebrews arrived in Egypt and how an empire that seemed invincible was shaken by an enslaved people. A new scene will be set. The stage for one of history's greatest confrontations was ready, and it all started with a dream. The story of the Exodus doesn't begin with plagues or miracles. It begins with a dream that led a young Hebrew into the heart of the most powerful empire of the ancient world. His name was Joseph. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, he ended up in Egypt, and through an unusual gift of interpreting dreams, he earned the Pharaoh's trust. In a time of famine, he saved the kingdom from scarcity, and as a reward, he was elevated to the second most powerful position in the nation. His rise marked the beginning of the Hebrew presence in Egypt. Over the years, his brothers also migrated there. At first, the Hebrews thrived, multiplied, and were well received. But everything changed with the arrival of a new king, who knew not Joseph, as the biblical text says. The dynasty changed, the politics shifted, and the foreigners, once allies, were now seen as a threat. Fear grew that the Hebrews might join Egypt's enemies in the event of war, and so, little by little, the chosen people were subjected to slavery. From partners, they became an oppressed labor force. Egypt at that time wasn't just any kingdom. It was a superpower with well-organized armies, advanced engineering, and a religious structure that ruled every aspect of daily life. Pharaohs were seen as living gods, holders of absolute power. To defy a pharaoh was to challenge the very order of the cosmos. Imagine then the weight of the divine decision to raise an ordinary man, Moses, to confront this colossal system. It was more than a mission. It was a revolution. The Hebrews, under whips and bricks, built cities and monuments that immortalized Egypt's glory. But in silence, they cried out for deliverance. For generations, their voices echoed among mute gods and towering pyramids. And then, the unseen answered. The cry of the slaves pierced the veil between heaven and earth, and the divine choice fell upon someone unlikely. A fugitive, raised among Egypt's princes, now herding sheep in the desert. The choice of Moses marked the beginning of an epic confrontation, not between armies, but between wills. One man against an empire, a staff against a crown, a landless people against a nation that ruled the known world. The stage was set, the script in motion, and the story began to unfold. What was about to happen would shake not only Egypt, but the very understanding of what divine intervention means. And it's at this point that we begin to grasp the true magnitude of the context. The Exodus wasn't just the escape of a people, it was the symbolic and literal dismantling of an empire that believed itself invincible. Behind every plague, behind every command from Moses, there was something deeper. A direct strike at the heart of Egypt's religious, political, and economic systems. It was as if, one by one, the pillars of that world were being torn down by invisible hands, responding to the cry of a people no one else could hear. The enslavement of the Hebrews wasn't just a dark chapter in history. It was the boiling point of an age-old tension, an open wound preparing the ground for an unprecedented confrontation. Because when an oppressed people find a leader who hears the call from above, no pyramid is high enough to stop their liberation. The time of miracles, or natural phenomena, as some might say, was about to begin. And that time would begin with an encounter in the desert, a bush that burned without being consumed, a calling no one expected, and a man who would have to choose between silence or facing Pharaoh himself. He grew up among marble columns and priests crowned with gold. He had Hebrew blood, but was raised as an Egyptian prince. Moses wasn't just a foreigner with access to the palace. He was part of the system. He knew its rituals, its gods, its language, and its weaknesses. But he also carried within him a wound that tied him to the enslaved people. A divided identity, as if he lived between two worlds that were never meant to touch, until one day, everything collapsed. When he saw a Hebrew being beaten, Moses acted. He killed an Egyptian, he fled, and disappeared into the desert. Years passed. Now far from the halls of power, Moses was just a shepherd, a man forgotten by the empire that once welcomed him. And it was in this exile that something unexplainable happened. On top of a mountain, he saw a bush on fire. But the fire did not consume it. The bush burned without being destroyed. A vision that defied logic and interrupted his routine with a calling, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." It was the beginning of a mission that would change the course of history. But Moses hesitates. He questions. He doubts. Who am I to face Pharaoh? The doubt is understandable. He had no armies, no status, no real bond with the people. He was just a broken man. And that's precisely where the mystery lies. Why would God choose someone like him? Why not raise up a warrior, a priest, a born leader? Perhaps because in his fragility, Moses became dependent on something greater than himself. And in that emptiness, divine power could shine more clearly. God then gives him signs. His staff becomes a serpent. His hand turns leprous and then is healed. Water turns into blood. All this to convince him that he would not be alone. The mission was clear. Go back to Egypt and set the Hebrew people free. But free them. How? Facing Pharaoh wasn't just a political act. It was an assault on the order of the gods. A challenge to Ma'at itself, the cosmic balance, according to the Egyptians. It was a declaration, there is a God above all of you, and that was intolerable. And there was another, subtle yet explosive question. Did Moses and Pharaoh grow up together? Were they adopted brothers? The Bible doesn't say clearly, but many scholars believe they did. If that's true, the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh wasn't just spiritual or political, it was personal. A duel between two men who once shared childhood memories, now standing on opposite sides of destiny, one chosen by the gods, the other by God. What makes this story resonate so deeply even today is precisely its ambiguity. Was Moses a man or a legend, a liberator guided by heaven, or simply someone brave enough to confront an empire on behalf of his people? Whether the signs were real or symbolic doesn't really matter. What matters is what they represented, a calling to abandon fear and embrace a mission that seemed impossible, and he accepted it. From that moment on, what unfolds is a narrative that blurs the lines between the natural and the supernatural. A man with a staff and a promise walks back to the place he once fled and goes straight to the most feared throne in the ancient world with a single message: let my people go. From that point forward, the empire's clock begins to unravel, not through war, but through events that shake Egypt down to its foundations. Now, with Moses back in Egypt, a new chapter begins. The clash between faith and power, between a slave and a king, between heaven's miracles and the forces of nature. Because what comes next are not just signs, they are plagues, 10 events that bring all of Egypt to its knees. And the great question remains, were they miracles or natural phenomena perfectly aligned by divine precision? Night falls over Egypt, and the Nile whispers its calm flow, until suddenly its waters turn to blood. Fish float lifeless. The stench of decay spreads. Panic erupts. This marks the beginning of what would be remembered for generations as divine judgment upon the land of the pharaohs. 10 plagues, 10 precise strikes. But what exactly were these plagues? Supernatural miracles sent by God, or a chain reaction of natural phenomena that, because of their sequence and intensity, appeared to be the work of the divine? The first plague turns the Nile into blood. For those of faith, it is the hand of God defiling Egypt's greatest life source. For science, there's another possibility. The outbreak of toxic algae, known as red tide, can turn water red, contaminated and deadly to aquatic life. Without fish, without oxygen, the river becomes a corridor of death. And with the river's death comes ecological collapse. The second plague follows as a natural consequence of the first. With an uninhabitable aquatic environment, desperate frogs flee to dry land. thousands, maybe millions, leaping through streets, homes, and temples. A biological chaos, but their mass death triggers a side effect, the third plague. As the frogs decay, lice and mosquitoes emerge. An ecological imbalance unleashed by a single rupture point. The fourth plague, swarms of flies, fits perfectly into this scenario. An Egypt suffocated by insects, carrying disease and disruption. And with them comes the fifth plague, pestilence among livestock, cattle dropping dead. A possible viral outbreak spread by infected flies. Egypt's rural economy, built on livestock, begins to crumble. Agriculture follows the same path. The empire slowly starts to bleed. The sixth plague strikes human bodies directly. Boils, open sores, widespread infections. Could this be the result of a sanitary collapse? Perhaps due to contact with contaminated water, infectious insects and unburied corpses. No need to invoke the supernatural to describe the horror, yet the moment carries a spiritual weight. The empire of the gods is being humiliated. One by one, the religious pillars fall. No Egyptian deity can stop the next catastrophe. The seventh plague falls from the sky. Literally, hail mixed with fire. A rare yet possible phenomenon. An extreme thunderstorm with hailstones and fiery lightning. Some scholars believe it could have been caused by distant volcanic activity, whose ash clouds altered the local climate. To the people, it was the sky in fury. To science, it was the atmosphere reacting to environmental collapse. Then come the locusts, the eighth plague, one of the most common and devastating in the region. Hungry insects drawn to weakened fields, they devour what's left. Egypt, once a symbol of abundance, now becomes synonymous with scarcity. The cycle is nearly complete. And then, darkness. The ninth plague covers the land with palpable darkness. It could have resulted from volcanic ash, sandstorms, or even an eclipse. What matters is the impact. The Egyptians, who worshipped the sun god Ra, now watched their supreme deity disappear before their eyes. And finally, the final blow, the death of the firstborns, a plague that defies any simple explanation. Some suggest the release of poisonous gas from underground, accumulating in low-lying enclosed areas, typically where the eldest son slept. Others point to grain stores contaminated with deadly fungi. But to the Hebrews, it was the ultimate judgment, a selective act, a sign that liberation was near. If all these plagues have natural explanations, does that make them any less powerful, or even more terrifying? The idea that nature turned against Egypt with such precision and force would in itself be a miracle, a staggering synchrony. As if creation itself responded to the cry of the oppressed. Faith and science, rather than cancelling each other out, intertwine in an even more compelling narrative. But the greatest miracle was still to come, because even after 10 signs of devastation, Pharaoh allowed them to leave and then changed his mind. The Hebrew people marched toward freedom, but in front of them stood a sea, and behind, an army. The next step would be decisive, an event that would divide the waters, literally. The sound of chariot wheels cut through the silence of the desert. Pharaoh, blinded by rage, had commanded his cavalry to pursue the very people he had just set free. At the front, Moses led a weary crowd. No weapons, no military strategy, guided only by faith. And then the inevitable. In front of them, the Red Sea. Behind them, the Egyptian army advancing, a perfect trap. A people cornered between the sword and the sea. It was the end or the beginning of something impossible. The biblical account tells us that Moses, in an act of obedience and faith, raised his staff. A strong east wind blew all night long. The waters parted. A dry path formed between liquid walls. The people crossed. When the Egyptians tried to follow, the waters returned, swallowing the soldiers and their chariots. An epic display of deliverance. But what if there's another explanation? Some scholars suggest that the original term translated as Red Sea might actually refer to the Sea of Reeds, a shallow, marshy area further north. In such regions, natural phenomena like tidal retreats and strong winds can, in fact, temporarily expose dry ground. In 2010, a computer simulation by scientists showed that winds of around 60 miles per hour could push the waters of a shallow bay aside for several hours, creating a dry corridor. Scientifically possible. Coincidence? Providence? Another theory points to earthquakes or tectonic shifts that could have triggered sudden water withdrawals, like reverse tsunamis, where the seafloor is exposed before the water returns in a powerful surge. For those who lived through it, the exact mechanism doesn't matter. What they witnessed was a miracle. A path opened in the midst of the impossible. And what about Pharaoh's army? Some archaeologists claim to have found chariot wheels submerged in the Gulf of Suez. Others argue there's no definitive evidence of a drowned army. Still, the symbolic impact remains. An empire that tried to crush a defenseless people was defeated not by weapons, but by forces beyond its control. For the Hebrews, the crossing was more than an escape. It was a rebirth. They left Egypt as slaves, they crossed as a free people, and that crossing became the heart of the Exodus, a boundary between a past of oppression and a future of promise. Something that, even millennia later, still echoes in traditions, celebrations, and the very identity of a people. The event of the crossing defies easy explanations. Perhaps it was a natural phenomenon, perhaps it was divine intervention, or maybe both. A miracle carried out through natural means, with timing so precise, so improbable, that its very improbability becomes the greatest proof that something extraordinary was at work. Because sometimes, what we call a miracle is simply the extraordinary disguised as chance. But the journey was far from over. The crossing of the sea was only the beginning. The great question that still echoes among historians and archaeologists remains: is there real evidence that all of this truly happened? Where are the Egyptian records, the traces, the physical clues that support the greatest liberation story ever told? For centuries, scholars have combed deserts, papyri, tombs, and ruins in search of one answer. Did the Exodus really happen? Is it possible to confirm with material evidence that an enslaved people escaped from one of the most organized and controlling empires of the ancient world? And if it did happen, why did Egypt, so meticulous in recording its victories and glories, remain silent about such a humiliating defeat? The first explanation may lie in Egypt's own record-keeping policies. It was common for defeats and embarrassing events to be erased or simply never documented. Pharaohs wanted to be remembered as invincible. A fall at the hands of a group of slaves, led by a former prince, would be an unacceptable stain on any dynasty's legacy. So the absence of records may not mean denial of the event, but rather a deliberate cover-up. One of the most intriguing clues is the so-called Ipuwer Papyrus, discovered in Egypt. The document describes a time of chaos. The river turns to blood, the land is in disorder, servants flee, children die, and the poor inherit the riches. The parallel with the biblical account is striking. Although many scholars argue the text is poetic or symbolic, others see in it a real echo of the dark days of the plagues. In addition, archaeological findings in the Sinai desert point to large-scale movements of nomadic groups. Remnants of pottery, rudimentary inscriptions, and signs of prolonged encampments suggest that a people lived there for a long time. We can't say with certainty that they were the Hebrews of the Exodus, but the possibility exists and grows with each new excavation. Another point to consider is that Egypt, at the time, was under pressure from external invasions and internal instability. Some researchers believe the Exodus may have occurred during one of these transitional or collapsing periods, which would explain the lack of official records. It's as if history hid itself in the cracks of a crumbling civilization. So does the absence of absolute proof mean the Exodus never happened? Not necessarily. Biblical archaeology works with fragments, shadows, circumstantial evidence, and even when there are no certainties, the accumulation of clues carries weight. Because in history, silence also speaks, and sometimes what is not written reveals the most. With or without irrefutable proof, the Exodus remains one of the pillars of a people's identity and of a faith. A story of liberation that withstands time, doubt, and the dust of ages. But what if it really happened? If Moses truly walked at the front of a fleeing people? What does that teach us today? A land in silence. A people marching into the unknown, behind them the ruins of a shaken empire, ahead the promise of freedom. The Exodus was not merely an escape, it was a turning point between slavery and identity, between oblivion and history. Whether it happened through miracle or natural forces, we may never know for sure. But one thing is undeniable. The impact of that journey still echoes today as an eternal whisper that no empire lasts forever and no chain is unbreakable. Throughout this video, we explored the extraordinary not as the opposite of reason, but as its complement. We saw that the plagues may have had natural causes, algae, mosquitoes, fungi, gases, but the deeper question remains, what if these events, though explainable, occurred at the exact time, in the precise order, at the most symbolic moment? Does that nullify the miracle or make it even greater? Science can explain the how, but maybe faith lies in the why. The Exodus, with or without material evidence, has shaped nations, inspired revolutions, and given voice to the oppressed. It speaks of courage, leadership, and belief. Moses, a flawed and hesitant man, became a symbol of liberation because he dared to obey a calling. And the Hebrew people, though enslaved, rose with dignity, proving that no power, no matter how mighty, can silence a heart that longs to be free. The account of the plagues also invites us to reflect. Are we, today, ignoring the signs around us? Ecological collapse, natural disasters, climate imbalances. Are these just coincidences? Or is nature once again crying out for justice? Perhaps the true lesson of the Exodus is this. When the arrogance of an empire challenges the balance of creation, something greater always rises up. And now I ask you, if these stories are true, what does that change in you? And if they are only symbols, what can we still learn from them? Because whether by faith or by logic, what stands before us is a narrative that transcends time, a reminder that the impossible can happen, that the sea can part, that the unlikely can be real, that there is a way out even when everything seems lost. If this video helped you see the Exodus with new eyes, then like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue uncovering the hidden mysteries behind the verses. Drop a comment below. Had you heard of these interpretations about the plagues and the escape from Egypt? Which view impacted you the most, the supernatural or the scientific? We want to hear from you, because here every question is an invitation to discovery. And remember, between miracle and phenomenon, there is a bridge called purpose. And maybe that's what makes the Exodus unforgettable.